In the second audio in this series, I offered an overview of how the Catholic Church currently understands its mission and the mission of all Christians in the world today. And this mission, as we saw, is broad and multifaceted. It encompasses every compassionate act which would meet human need and improve relationships and communities, and every verbal and nonverbal testament to God's love and mercy, which would awaken faith and hope in human hearts. It's a mission to be a tangible sign of God's reality to every person, medicine to the wounds of the world, and a force of goodness to hasten the full coming of the kingdom on earth. All this I characterized as the what of Christian mission, the general kinds of activities that the Church sees itself sent into the world to carry out, along with the intellectual work of discerning and understanding that calling, and teaching and expressing that understanding in every possible cultural form to animate and inspire the Christian community to act. At the same time, we noted that the Church also has well-developed ideas on how these activities are to be carried out. They should be carried out in a way that is ever attentive to God's saving presence outside the Church, ever respectful of every person's human dignity and religious freedom, and ever mindful of the need to approach the wider human family with humility and with the kind and faithful heart of a loving mother. Any kind of superior, condemning, defensive, or bureaucratic manner is unacceptable and counter to the gospel. Those responsible for carrying out these activities, finally, include not only every individual Christian, parish community, and institution within the Church, but the combined body of all Christians acting in harmony, Catholics and non-Catholics alike. For only in the display of unity among Christians is the good news fully manifest. Thus, mission activity for the Catholic Church is inextricably tied to ecumenical activity, to working toward greater Christian unity, and to doing everything possible with other churches. And by extension, it's also tied to cooperation with people of other religions and all people of goodwill. Now, if one understands this much about what the Catholic Church sees its mission and the mission of its many institutions to be, one understands quite a lot. But as I noted at the end of the last audio, this description does not quite cover everything essential one would need to know in order to appreciate what the basic phenomenon of Christian mission is all about. It's necessary to develop this description further by adding to it something about the religious experience and vision that motivates and underlies these activities. For the activities of Christian mission, like all human activities, are not just bare external gestures stripped of all meaning and intentionality. They are motivated and inspired activities, filled with significance for those who perform them. They spring from a deeper source that is not directly visible, just as a tree has roots that extend deep underground that are real and strong, but out of sight. In the last audio, we considered the most obvious attributes of mission, the what and the how and the who of mission. And to extend my analogy, we might think of all of these as the trunk and the branches and the leaves of the tree, all quite visible. But now we need to go deeper and examine the roots, or the more spiritual factors that are the source of these activities and that distinguish the properly Christian intentions at work when they are being performed. So the focus of this audio then will be on exploring that meaningful vision and experience that animates and inspires Christians to carry out the tasks of mission. It will be on identifying those less obvious and invisible roots that nourish and uphold the visible tree. Exploring this topic, as we'll see, is necessary not only to help us understand the meaning of Christian mission in its fullness, it's also necessary to help us understand what it means for a Catholic college or university, or any Catholic institution for that matter, to call itself Catholic. It means being inspired, in part, by a particular vision of the nature of human existence that then informs and gives the institution specific values and perspectives on its work and on the circumstances it faces. We'll pick up on this important characteristic of Catholic institutions in a later audio. But turning now to the topic at hand, let me begin with a preliminary observation that I hope will help us appreciate the power of the Christian vision of life in our world today. And I say hope because the Western academic world, including even some Catholic universities in it, often struggles to appreciate the enormous and positive significance of Christianity as a force affecting people's lives today. And this is for a number of reasons which we don't need to get into. But the fact is, the Christian religion, in its many variations, and despite the many real flaws of Christians themselves, remains among the most attractive and powerful social forces currently at work in the world. Now, here in the United States, this statement might strike some people as a bit off. For over the last several decades, all branches of Christianity in the U.S. have suffered significant declines in membership, especially among the young. And church life in many parishes is not uncommonly gray-haired, inward-looking, and lackluster. But as true as all this is, it's only true in part. The cup, at the very least, is as full as it is empty, for 2/3 of Americans still self-identify as Christian, and it's not hard to go anywhere in the U.S. and find a worshiping community where the faith is meaningfully lived out. Globally, in addition, Christianity is not declining, but growing. And in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, it is positively surging and full of youth and exuberance. Viewed across the span of its 2,000-year history, furthermore, the continuous vitality of Christianity is remarkable. If one simply considers the number of Christians in the world today, which is 1 out of every 3 people on the planet, and the number of different cultures, linguistic groups, and local settings in which the faith has taken root, Christianity stands out as the most successful cross-cultural movement in human history, with the Catholic Church in particular claiming the distinction of being the oldest, largest, most culturally diverse organization the world has ever seen. Now, all this does not attest exclusively to the success of Christian mission, but a lot of it does. And so the capacity of the Christian tradition to attract and retain adherents and to shape their actions in the world should not be overlooked or downplayed. At the heart of Christianity is clearly something very compelling that is driving its continuous practice over time and across numerous cultures. But what is it? What is it about the Christian faith that continues to appeal to so many people and that continues to motivate so much mission-centered engagement? It is, I propose, to a very significant degree, the Christian vision or outlook on life itself. And to understand that and why it is so compelling, we need to explore 2 further aspects of mission, which I'm going to refer to as the where of mission and the why of mission. To go back to my earlier tree metaphor, these 2 aspects together, we can say, represent the inner spiritual roots nurturing and supporting the larger phenomenon of Christian mission. They refer to 2 aspects of the wider Christian outlook and vision of life that motivates the performance of mission activities. And it's important for us to explore these 2 topics because it's impossible to really appreciate Christian mission without understanding what sustains and causes it. And what does that is the Christian faith itself, deeply appropriated and understood in terms of what I'll call the where of mission and the why of mission. So first, the where of mission. And to get us into this topic, we need to start by reflecting a bit on what it is that motivates human beings in general. Given the enormous success Christianity has had across different cultures and historical eras, it clearly is speaking meaningfully to some of the deepest concerns of the human heart. So to guide our thinking on these matters, I'm going to draw on the work of the University of Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith, who has written extensively on human motivation, religion, and the practice of the Christian faith. According to Smith, we humans are motivated to pursue 6 basic and fundamental things. And I trust his list will resonate with most people since it's similar to psychologist Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. First, Smith says, we are motivated to seek bodily survival, security, and pleasure. We have a need to foster our own physical well-being. Second, we are motivated to understand the natural and social worlds around us and our place in them. We all have an intellectual need to know reality. Third, we are motivated to maintain an enduring and positive sense of ourselves over time. We have a psychological need, or a need rooted in our very being as persons, to possess an affirmative and coherent personal identity. Fourth, we all have a need for some control over our lives, a need to exercise our abilities and shape our environments. We naturally desire self-determination, or what Smith calls the exercise of our own purposive agency. Fifth, we are all motivated to live what we understand to be good and worthy lives, and to see ourselves personally as good people. And even when we fail to meet whatever standards we hold, we still desire to meet them. We each have a deep-seated moral need to be and to know ourselves as fundamentally good people. And sixth, we all have a desire for social belonging and love, for friends and family and other significant relationships, and for belonging and participation in social groups in which we are valued and value others in turn. Finally, pervading and transcending these 6 basic human motivations is something even more fundamental, which is an overarching and governing desire to have the best possible lives for ourselves. It's a drive to have happy, meaningful, flourishing lives, and it is a need so pervasive and primordial to everything we do and hope for that, following Aristotle, Smith proposes that we think of it as the natural goal or end of human life, the basic destination that each of us experiences ourselves being innately drawn toward, though we may not succeed in reaching it or in reaching it fully. That's Smith's description of what makes us tick, and I think it goes a long way toward characterizing what our lives are like. But let me add one other element to help fill out the picture of human existence he gives us. All these natural human desires and motivations play out on a very large stage, and that's on the stage of existence or life itself. They don't occur to us in a vacuum, but in the wider environment of the universe in which we find ourselves. So we also need to characterize this, at least briefly, in order to fill out the picture he gives us. So let me build on his insights with some thoughts in this direction, and I trust my characterization is rudimentary enough to fit with everyone's experience. Life, we can say, is a tremendous number of things all at once. It is good and beautiful and full of things that delight and attract us and satisfy our hopes and longings. And it's also at times terrible and tragic and excruciatingly painful for a shocking number of people and in an endless array of ways. There is no limit, it seems, to the kinds of difficulties we face. Life, we know, can be heaven and it can be hell. And for each of us, it's also a restless search, a journey into the unknown, and an ongoing challenge to achieve the things we need and desire and to stave off the many evils and misfortunes that hamper us. The natural environment in which we find ourselves awes us with its grandeur and intricate detail, and the psychological and social worlds we inhabit are equally weighty and immense in their power over us. We engage with all of this with every possible human emotion, from amazement and joy to sorrow and despair, and also with lots of questions and confusion. Certainly, there's a lot we can comprehend, but there are many things that remain deeply mysterious to us, and that all our accumulated insight and scientific understanding can't penetrate. We wonder, for example, why are we all here? What's our purpose? Is there a God watching out for us? Is this life all there is? And why do we suffer so much? In this respect, we live simultaneously in the light and in the shadows, by faith and by sight. And for all our abilities and hopes for happiness, it's remarkable how easy it is for us to fail or to ruin things for ourselves or others. So life as we know is a puzzle, and it's also not fair. We humans can be generous and despicable to each other, magnificent and monstrous all at the same time. We're so full of potential and promise, and yet so needy, vulnerable, and inevitably wounded by others, by ourselves, and by circumstances beyond our control. Life is all of these things simultaneously, in a continuously flowing, sometimes bewildering stream of events. That's the larger stage on which we all live, and in the midst of which we seek what we seek. So now, keeping all of this in mind, let's turn back to our question. What then does Christianity say about all this that's so compelling to so many people? What light does it shine on our human predicament? Well, there's no simple answer to this question, but let me say that Christianity has been so successful and widely embraced, in part because it addresses, on some level, practically all of our basic human needs, and because it consistently gives people meaning, joy, purpose, direction, peace, contentment, hope, and empowerment to face the challenges of life. It's been, for countless numbers of people, a master key to unlock the mystery of living and to show the way to a flourishing life. Specifically, it has done 5 important things, which I'll note briefly. And my account here once again relies heavily on the work of Christian Smith, particularly an article of his entitled, "Why Christianity Works." First, Christianity is so attractive to so many people because it makes them feel at home in the universe. To quote Smith, it teaches that the universe is not an empty, dead expanse of rock, gases, and fire extending to infinity or nothingness. Rather, reality at its heart is living, warm, and personal, and beyond the cosmic expanse exists a conscious, engaged, remembering, answering person who cares deeply about the earth and its frail inhabitants. Everything existent is held in the lovingly cupped hands of a personal, attentive God who listens, who knows, who remembers, who answers, and who will in time make all things right. This understanding of existence as a whole makes people feel secure and confident that their hopes and needs are ultimately known and supported. The universe in the end, for all its very real terrors, is a good place, and we ourselves are treasured parts of it, God's beloved children. Second, Christianity speaks directly to the central need we all have to be loved and affirmed in our deepest selves, and to know ourselves as inherently good and valuable. According to Christianity, God is unconditional love and intimately knows and cares about every unique human self. And it is in God's very own nature to meet this need of ours. God loves each one of us just as we are, and to know this love firsthand, even just once, is often enough to sustain a lifetime of troubles. And this is something Christianity also professes as a possibility for every person. God is not unreachable, but knowable, and those who seek will find. Third, Christianity speaks meaningfully to the worst experiences we humans face. While it doesn't attempt to explain the ultimate origin of evil, or why everything that happens, or why in the end we suffer so much, it does insist that God always hears our cries and is ceaselessly at work in answering them, and desires nothing more than our complete well-being in this life. In fact, the main storyline and message of the Bible recounts God's continuous efforts to address human suffering and to bring about the complete arrival of the world as God intended it to be, His kingdom on earth. And through every hardship and tragedy and injustice, Christians gain strength from the assurance that God's ultimate victory over evil will one day come. Until that day, we can trust in God's ongoing love and care for each one of us. Fourth, and connected to this, Christianity speaks with compelling insight and realism about what's wrong with us, about the evil and sin that infect our lives, and about the guilt and shame and brokenness that inevitably follow. And as Smith notes, this might not seem like something that would attract people to Christianity, but in fact it does, because it perceptively diagnoses the nature and extent of our self-destructiveness and our recurrent failures to flourish, both individually and collectively. At the same time, it points to a way out of the mess we're in, and this way comes in the form of God's concrete moral guidance to us and in the possibility of receiving God's forgiveness and restorative love. And these things speak deeply to our need first to experience ourselves as good and worthy and washed clean after we've done wrong, and second to our need to navigate the murky and often morally ambiguous paths of life. Christianity is so successful in part because it doesn't paper over these problems or offer a merely superficial solution. It accurately identifies the problem as catastrophic and endemic to the human condition, and it offers real hope and resources to help each one of us address it. Fifth and finally, Christianity describes life as tremendously meaningful and purpose-filled. This is first of all because each of us matter in God's eyes, and therefore everything we do and everything we experience matters too, being held in God's loving gaze. Yet it's also because Christians believe that God's providence ultimately encompasses all things, the bad as well as the good, and that God will eventually make everything right. Christians therefore can face even the worst experiences, including tragedy and death, with some form of hope. Finally, life is meaningful for Christians because the gospel message calls believers to an inspiring purpose, which is to continue Jesus' mission of hastening the coming of the kingdom on earth. Participating in this great calling, with the assurance of God's care at every moment, is a wellspring to fill Christians' lives with great meaning and contentment. I could certainly add more at this point, for example, about how the various forms of Christian community life address people's social needs, or about how, in numerous ways, Christianity supports the human quest for flourishing more generally, including in the promotion of the arts and sciences, medicine, culture, education, and technology, and through the simple assurance of God's responsiveness to our prayers. But I trust that the 5 points I just mentioned are sufficient to illuminate, at least in a basic way, why Christianity has appealed to so many people through the centuries and across an enormous variety of cultures. Quite simply, Christianity offers a compelling and deeply life-affirming vision of human existence that speaks relevantly to people's physical, intellectual, psychological, agential, moral, and social needs. And it also addresses some of the deepest questions we humans can ask. It proposes a meaningful and hope-filled framework for facing life's difficulties and dilemmas, and it assures people of a caring, forgiving, and attentive God who wants nothing but the best for human beings and our world. All this and more helps explain Christianity's remarkable vitality and staying power over time. And it also helps us understand a large part of what motivates the practice of Christian mission. Now, I introduced all this in connection to what I called the where of mission. But what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if you're a Christian, this deeper description of the world or life that I've just provided is where Christians see themselves living. It's the larger stage of existence that they see themselves walking upon. A meaningful, divinely created, purposeful, cherished, and morally ordered world. This is the world they inhabit, and not some other world. Now this, of course, is the same world that non-Christians and non-religious people inhabit, but it's known and experienced by Christians in a unique way. And it is this deeply meaningful experience of life as a whole that makes the performance of mission-centered acts a natural thing for Christians to engage in, at least in part. Christians, in other words, are motivated to mission, not just because they receive certain isolated signals telling them to do this or that, to feed the hungry or clothe the naked or care for the sick. This is true, but only partly, because on a more fundamental level, it's their distinctive experience of life as a whole that predisposes them to do unto others and reciprocate the love they have received. This is the sociological phenomenon that Christian Smith calls living in a morally significant universe. And there are many varieties of this, both religious and non-religious, but the way it works for Christians is that by believing and experiencing themselves living in this divinely created, morally governed universe, they're then motivated to act in a certain direction toward doing God's will and the good and away from doing evil or the bad. It's their basic assumptions about life as a whole, or the morally significant way in which the universe exists for them, that leads Christians to live as they are called to. This influence is not all-encompassing, of course, For Christians, as often as anyone else, fail to do what they know they ought to do, and not all are formed to the same degree, but the influence is present and operative on some fundamental level. And in saying this, I don't just mean that Christian ideas alone have this effect in a purely psychological way. To think of the situation in this way would be to assume that Christian beliefs are not also possibly true claims about reality. From a Christian point of view, they are true, and because this is what the universe really is like, it's the force of reality itself, as objectively and accurately known by the Christian, that has this effect upon them. Or more specifically, we can say that it's the very real presence of God who has this effect upon them and who permeates their overall experience of life in a morally significant way. And all of this is what I mean by the where or the setting of mission being a motivating influence upon Christians' behavior. Now let's reflect on this a bit further. We can all picture this happening in the life of an individual Christian. But what might it be like for a Christian institution to believe and live in the morally significant universe of Christianity? Specifically, what might be involved for a Catholic university to be nurtured and motivated to carry out its mission in this way? This is not an idle question to ask, because institutions are not individuals, and because in many public settings in the United States, a secular outlook holds sway, and proponents of secularism are seldom at ease unless religious voices are silenced, dismissed, or otherwise assigned a marginal significance. It's also not an idle question to ask because Catholic universities in the United States and elsewhere are typically places with a religiously plural workforce, and ensuring the religious freedom and dignity of every person, religious and non-religious, is an important Catholic value. So how can Catholic universities be places that operate within the morally significant universe of Christianity? Well, there's much that can be said on this topic, but let me just say that for this to take place, 3 things at minimum are required. First, it's necessary that a significant number of members of the Catholic university community, and especially a significant number of its leaders, actually be Christians, who see themselves living within the Christian universe and who can articulate that thoughtfully to others. Only ultimately in this way, it seems, is it possible for the properly Christian ideals and practices and values of the institution to be meaningfully upheld and advanced. That is, by being grounded in the personal commitment and spiritual lives of its different members. Not everyone needs to believe, but enough do. Second, it requires that the Catholic university nurture an inclusive and welcoming space for all its community members, while at the same time nurturing a space that is both openly religious and confidently Christian. The Catholic university must cultivate a kind of open and Christian public space, in contrast to a closed and secular space in which religious voices of any kind are not included and are not welcome. This is not always an easy balance to strike, especially in places like the United States, where Christianity is commonly co-opted by divisive political interests, and where it is often perceived by many as hate-filled or excluding of certain groups of people. But it can be done, and it must be done, ecumenically and interreligiously. Otherwise, the university cannot continue to exist as a safe and supportive place for Christians to grow in their faith and to be open about who they are. And going back to my first point, this also requires the presence of knowledgeable, thoughtful, and committed Christians on staff who can show that the Christian tradition at its best is not what some of its worst proponents make it out to be, but is rather potentially a source of profound intellectual, moral, and spiritual enrichment for all people. Third and finally, and for the sake of all in the university community who are not Catholic or Christian or religious, the institution must model an approach to learning and to the mystery of life that is simultaneously committed to sustaining the Christian tradition and yet humble enough about its hold on truth to be ever ready to engage with those of other views and to learn from them. That is, it requires an intellectual culture that is expansive and embracing in this respect, honest about the ultimate questions of life being truly questions for many people, and eager to dialogue and build bridges of understanding across every difference of perspective. All this would stand in contrast to the narrow, defensive, and anti-intellectual approaches of fundamentalists of all kinds, either religious fundamentalists or secular fundamentalists, all who tend to treat opposing views with fear, scorn, or automatic close-minded rejection. The Catholic University, in other words, must sustain a culture that is characterized by a kind of centered pluralism, centered in being engaged in a primary way with the Christian tradition, yet plural in being open and interested in engaging with all views. This will ensure both the religious freedom of the institution to be and remain Catholic in the wider secular environment of the U.S., and the religious freedom of every individual community member to live according to their conscience and in the integrity of their own search for truth. This last point is especially worth noting because most public or secular universities, by contrast, are not generally supportive of the religious identities of their individual community members. On the surface, they might seem to be, since they happily tolerate the private exploration of all religions and ways of life, and appear impartial in not publicly privileging any one religious tradition. But in fact, they tend to publicly privilege a non-religious outlook, while at best assigning only subjective significance to religious views, meaningful for the believing individual perhaps, but otherwise not to be taken seriously as offering potentially true descriptions of the world or human existence. And so, intentionally or not, as environments, they tend to promote living in morally thin or insignificant universes. Is there a God? An ultimate reason why we're all here? Who knows? Is there a reason to hope for a better future for all of us? For ultimate justice? Or even just a personal destiny in which we can expect eventually to be happy? Who can say? What about finding meaning in the face of violence and death or pending ecological destruction? Well, we humans can't really answer those questions, and all that religious stuff is nice, but it's unprovable. So it's best to just focus on immediate concerns and on what's clear and obvious. Life at bottom can only be what we make it. This message is subtle, but potently unsupportive of religious perspectives or spiritual searching. Catholic universities, by contrast, take the opposite stand, that these questions are among the most important ones humans can ask, and that Christians are kin to all religious believers in affirming a transcendent goodness at the heart of all things. In its ecumenical and interreligious commitments, and in its philosophical openness furthermore, Catholic universities can provide a spiritual home for religious believers of all persuasions, as well as an intellectually serious environment for open-minded atheists and agnostics and seekers of all kinds. And in that sense, the universe Catholic universities inhabit is that much larger and that much more nurturing of every person's search for meaning, truth, hope, and ultimate purpose in life. Each of us still needs to undertake our own search, but Catholic universities offer significant resources and encouragement. So we've discussed the where of mission, or some of the major features of the morally significant outlook on life that makes Christianity so appealing for so many people to practice. Now let's expand this description and discuss what I'll call the why of mission, or some of the deeper aspects to this outlook that pertain especially to motivating the performance of the activities of mission. To return to my tree metaphor, both the where and the why aspects together refer to the spiritual roots undergirding and nurturing Christian commitment to mission. But if the where aspect refers to something basic, the why aspect refers to something more developed and mature. Or to put it another way, The Y aspect in particular refers to the roots becoming long and thick and numerous, and thus capable of supporting much greater growth. And to help clarify this point, let me say something now about the practice of mission in connection to the practice of Christianity more generally. And that is that not all Christian practices are mission practices, and not all Christians live mission-centered lives. Perhaps this point is obvious, but it deserves mentioning anyway. Mission practices specifically are those that reach out to others in some way, or that seek to make some positive change in the world. They are, in essence, other-directed, extroverted, or outward-moving acts, while the Christian faith more broadly also includes a huge number of more internally focused traditional practices, such as personal prayer and recollection, or community worship and discernment. Mission, though, specifically looks outward and with a high moral purpose that emanates from a sense of being personally sent by God to do something. And this is actually the root meaning of the word mission. It comes from the Latin word missio, which refers to the act of one person sending another person to do something. So the various acts of mission, as Christians understand them, are not just purposeful or goal-directed acts. Rather, they are sent acts or commissioned acts, or acts understood as originating ultimately with God. And because God's intentions for humankind, according to the Christian tradition, are unfailingly compassionate, loving, and good, and because God's ultimate goal for human history is to bring heaven down to earth, the acts of mission which advance this goal are, or are meant to be, salutary and altruistic acts. That is, they're fundamentally concerned with bettering the lives of others and bettering the state of the world. Now, this claim, of course, requires plenty of qualifications because Christians, like all people, are not perfect, and because even their best intended deeds can often be done poorly or mixed with baser motives, or even occasionally corrupted by extremely harmful ideas and attitudes. Any study of church history yields lots of examples to substantiate this. But all that said, just a moment's reflection on the kinds of activities I described in the last audio, I hope, serves to bring out the fact that what marks Christian mission most of all is an altruistic intention: to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to befriend the lonely, to reconcile enemies, to defend justice and human dignity, to promote the common good, to share the good news with all, to pray for people, and to provide them with meaning, hope, and moral guidance. Of all the things Christians do, these loving acts certainly are among the most beautiful and the most courageous. So when we ask about what it is that is motivating the performance of these acts in particular, we have to go beyond the appealing factors about the Christian view of life I mentioned earlier to something more vital, especially when we think about the sometimes heroic sacrifices borne by many practitioners of mission, or the more typical long-term hardship endured by those who persevere in a difficult task or ministry year after year. Clearly, there is a deeper source of inspiration at work in much of Christian outreach, a deepening or maturation of spirituality that generates powerful resources of dedication and conviction. But what is that? What is behind the remarkably moral and great-souled drive in the lives of genuinely other-centered Christians? This is an important question for Catholic universities to ponder, because so many tend to characterize themselves not only as faith-based Christian institutions, but as places where students are formed to become more compassionate and dedicated to improving the world, men and women for others, as the Jesuits put it. But how can we imagine this taking place? What combination of influences can lead someone to aspire to become a St. Francis of Assisi, or a Martin Luther King Jr., or a Dorothy Day, or an Annalena Tonelli? Most of us, after all, tend to just want to live our lives, which are often hard enough, and our sense of moral duty is often limited to fulfilling our family and work obligations and to avoid doing harm to others. So what would impel a person to do more? Sociologist Douglas Porpora offers an insightful answer to this question in his book Landscapes of the Soul, which is subtitled The Loss of Moral Meaning in American Life. Porpora begins by pointing out 3 factors that tend to occur together in the lives of most Americans. Namely, 1, a personal identity centered on the love of ordinary things such as family, work, rest, and personal enjoyment. 2, a significant degree of uncertainty about the ultimate meaning and purpose of life on the whole. And 3, a relatively low sense of moral obligation when it comes to helping others in society. Only a minority of Americans in Porpora's study were found to have a high sense of moral obligation to others and to be dedicated to achieving larger goods or advancing more ambitious social causes, such as working for justice and peace, protection of the environment, opportunity for all, care for the most vulnerable, or other similar altruistic goods for others or for the world beyond oneself. Those who did, interestingly, tended mostly to be not just religious, but highly religious. This was certainly not true in all cases, but in most cases it was. And what distinguished all these highly dedicated individuals from others, the religious and non-religious together, was that they all tended to have well worked out convictions about the ultimate meaning and purpose of life, not just for themselves individually, but for human beings generally. Their vision of life on the whole, or of what we all should be doing with our lives, was clearer and bigger than the average Americans. And their sense of self and individual calling as a consequence was correspondingly that much bigger. It's almost as if the roots of their own personal identity extended out beyond themselves into the heart of the universe itself, for their love of the world was that much larger. Now, for the religious people in this group, including the Christians, what stood out especially was 2 things. First, all of them tended to have a deep rooting in their religious tradition, and second, all of them tended to have some sense of being personally called to do what they were doing. And these 2 things together infused great moral purpose into their lives. Now, my point here is not that one needs to be religious or believe in God in order to be highly altruistic or other-centered. That's certainly not the case, and Porpora himself makes that point plain through stories of several people in his book, including one deeply committed Marxist. Rather, my point is that his analysis is helpful for understanding what makes the most altruistic, mission-centered Christians tick. And that seems to be a deep rooting in the Christian tradition, along with an inner conviction that God has personally given one an important task to accomplish. And this gets us finally to what I'm calling the why of mission. Why it is that mission and all other forms of Christian altruism happen. It's not just those 5 core features of the Christian vision of life I described earlier. That helps explain some of what motivates Christian practice. But to explain it fully, it's necessary to dig deeper and ask what it is that motivates some people to give of themselves in a self-sacrificial way, in many cases leaving behind the ordinary pleasures of life in order to improve the world or others' lives. It is, I believe, a deepening or an extension of the morally significant Christian view of life I described earlier under the heading of the where of mission, into a focused recognition that Christianity on the whole is ultimately about achieving great good for others and living a life of profound love, and that God is calling one by name and attracting one to do just this. Now, I alluded to the high moral calling of Christianity earlier, and especially in reference to the belief that God desires to enlist people in hastening the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. But references to it in the Christian tradition are actually innumerable. One finds it in the liturgy, in the lives of the saints, in modern magisterial teachings, and in theology, in Christian art, music, and literature, and in the vast repository of inspiring stories, actions, and images that fill local Christian community life. In the Bible, one finds it classically expressed in words such as the following: "Be holy as I am holy. Forgive 70 times 7 times. Love your enemies and pray for your persecutors. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Sell all that you have and give to the poor. Care for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Love as I have loved you. And go into all the nations proclaiming the gospel and teaching people to observe all that I have commanded." This is the radical core of the Christian message. And it's surprising how easy it is for Christians to filter out or rationalize away the altruistic calling that stands at the center of it all, and that Christianity asserts is the ultimate meaning and purpose of human life. But what happens with those who become truly outward moving and lovingly other-centered in mission is that, in one way or another, through the unique circumstances of their lives, they get the message loud and clear and come to realize that God is directing it personally to them and attracting them to a more other-centered life. And in the experience of hearing that calling, their hearts begin to expand with God's own care for the world. To go back to the stage metaphor that I introduced earlier, this deeper development of Christian identity is like coming to see oneself not just standing somewhat passively on the morally significant stage of the universe as Christians understand it to be. Rather, it's coming to see oneself being handed an important role to play on that stage. One finds oneself cast in a morally urgent drama, with God as the main character, the problems of humanity as the central dilemma, and the beauty of love as the meaning of it all. How will one act? What will one do with the time one has? The stakes are very high because the significance of one's own story is now part of the biblical drama itself and of God's cosmic effort to bring greater goodness and salvation to the world. And so one's own individual life begins to take on a whole new resonance. So what motivates Christians to engage in the acts of mission? Why do they do what they do? Ultimately, it's because, in one way or another, they heard God asking them, "Will you do this greatly needed and beautiful thing for me?" And they came to answer, "Yes, I will. With your help, I will." Let me now draw these comments to a close with an illustration and a simple point. Here at Clark University, we regularly retell the story of our founders, Mary Frances Clark and her 4 companions, who left behind families and homes in Ireland and began a whole new life in America dedicated to serving the poor. They had very few possessions and next to no idea what they were getting into, but they took that great leap of faith and came, eventually forming the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary and founding a huge number of schools, including the one that would eventually become Clark University. It's important for us to retell this story often here, because it's our story, and it's a unique one. But if we think about the deep Christian faith that was motivating Clark and her companions, their profound commitment to following Jesus and serving the cause of the gospel, we can see that from another perspective, their story is not unique after all, but is just one particular instance or version of a pattern that has played out continually in different times and places over the last 2,000 years, of individual Christians hearing the Christian message and then responding on a deeper level to God's call to them to come follow me, carry on my mission. This, I believe, is the real lesson in the story of Mary Frances Clark, and in the story of countless others who have sustained the work of Catholic higher education. And it's a story that speaks to all of those who work at Catholic universities today, because God speaks to each of us no less than to our founders and predecessors, and we, no less than any of them, are being invited to play a crucial role in carrying out God's ongoing mission in our world. Now, in the last audio, I described in broad terms how the Catholic Church understands that mission. And while we have yet to consider in any focused way how all this applies specifically to the work of Catholic education, one point I hope should be clear, and that is that for Catholic institutions of all kinds to continue to carry out their distinctively religious mission, they need to keep alive their motivation to do so, which springs from the Christian vision and inspiration of their founders. Only by attending to our spiritual and religious roots in the Christian tradition and outlook can Catholic colleges and universities hope to maintain not only their aspiration to carry on the Christian mission, but their motivation to do so.